Hello and welcome back to the History for Atheists video channel. I'm Tim O'Neill and I'm the author of the History for Atheists blog. Did Jesus exist? The short answer to this is yes, probably. That's the position of the overwhelming majority of scholars, including the overwhelming majority of non-Christian scholars. Now it should be emphasised that this consensus does not therefore mean these scholars are right, and the tiny minority who think he most likely didn't exist is therefore wrong. That would be an argument from authority. But the fact is that this huge consensus exists, and in history that means something. After all, academics work in an environment where it pays to find reasons to disagree with each other. So when they actually agree on anything, it's usually for good reason. Many atheists, however, find Jesus Mythicism, the idea that Jesus didn't exist in history at all, very attractive. And it seems quite a few champion this view, despite it being held by a very small number of actual scholars. They find it so attractive that they dismiss the widespread consensus on various grounds, arguing that most of these scholars are Christians or heavily influenced by Christianity, and so too dismissive of the Jesus mythicist alternative. But as I've already noted, the consensus is also held by most non-Christian scholars, including, as far as I can make out, all Jewish scholars who specialise in the period of Jewish history in which Jesus seems to have lived. These non-Christian scholars hold all kinds of ideas about Jesus which are totally contrary to Orthodox Christian beliefs. So the claim they would for some reason balk at the idea he didn't exist at all out of some kind of residual Christian influence makes very little sense. They accept he most likely existed purely because this is what the evidence seems to indicate. Of course, the Jesus they accept existed is not the Jesus Christ, who is the central figure of Christian belief, the second person of the Holy Trinity, who was God in human form and who walked on water, fed the 5,000 and rose from the dead and so on. They're talking about a historical human figure who was the point of origin for those later stories that are found in the Gospels and form the basis of those Christian beliefs. So here we mean a first century Jewish preacher who some came to believe was the Messiah and who later still became elevated to the highest possible status and eventually became considered to be God himself. Most secular critical scholars argue that even the later stories we have about him contain enough indications about the origins of those stories to show that he was a human Jewish preacher who was elevated in this way. Who and what the human historical Jesus was and how he fitted into his cultural context will be the subject of a later video here. It's also important to note the word probably in my answer to the question about whether this historical Jesus existed. Unlike some of the sciences, history can rarely arrive at definitive answers. Events happen and then are in the past, and historians are like detectives who examine the evidence they may leave behind to work out what probably happened. The further back in time we go, the more fragmentary and uncertain these traces tend to be. So when it comes to the pre-modern world, the sources, texts, passing references and documents, and perhaps archaeology that historians analyse make it impossible for them to do more than assess what is most likely. All historical analysis is a structured, evidence-based and careful assessment of likelihood. People who like definite answers or proof are usually going to find ancient history pretty frustrating or perhaps disappointing. This means we can't prove Jesus existed, but scholars can and do conclude that his existence makes most sense. Why is this? Given that we can't give a definitive answer to the question, it should be no surprise to learn that there's no single piece of relevant evidence that definitely shows that a historical Jesus existed. As with many things in the study of ancient history, the conclusion he most likely did exist depends on several vectors of evidence converging on that as the most likely conclusion. To begin with, all accounts or references to the origins of Christianity, both Christian and non-Christian, say it began with him. And none of them describe him as anything other than a historical human being, even if some of them, the Christian ones obviously, say that he was also much more than just a human. This doesn't mean that we can therefore definitely say he was a historical human being, but it does mean there is a strong a priori case for him having been so. After all, it would make a great deal of sense for all the sources to describe him as having been a historical human if in fact he was a historical human. That would explain the uniformity of the sources on this point. This means any claim that the later stories and references to him depict him in this way despite him not having been historical has an uphill battle. Such a claim not only has to explain how the stories about him arose, despite him not having existed at all, but also has to explain why they all depict him as historical and human with no traces of any earlier alternatives which have him as, say, purely mythic, allegorical or celestial. But beyond this a priori case, there are other reasons that a historical Jesus makes the most sense. There are elements in the earliest Christians' accounts of him that strongly indicate a historical person and are very difficult to interpret in any other way. Sometimes skeptics who accept Jesus Mythicism try to rule anything from the New Testament out of bounds on the question, claiming you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. This doesn't make much sense. Firstly, if we're looking at the issue of how those texts arose and whether the figure they describe has a historical basis, we clearly have to examine them critically to do this. To claim we can't examine them on this question is clearly absurd. How else would we investigate the issue of their claims without doing so? Secondly, we aren't reading them as parts of the Bible. We are critically and skeptically examining them as a historian examines any ancient text. They did not become part of the Bible until centuries after they were written, and a historian can and should examine them in the way that they examine any other source relevant to the question at hand in the examination of ancient history. For example, when Paul wrote the 7 letters that scholars agree are genuinely his, and are now books in the Bible, he didn't think he was writing Holy Scripture, let alone texts that would be pored over by people who believed they were the Word of God. He was simply writing letters. He probably wrote hundreds of letters to the various communities of the Jesus sect that he founded and visited around the Mediterranean. And this is why they are structured rhetorically like letters of the time and contain elements that we would expect to find in letters like greetings to specific individuals or promises of a future visit. The letters of Paul, which have survived to us, did so because they're full of his thoughts on theology, particularly his thinking on who and what Jesus was, and especially on how he believed Jesus' death, resurrection, and elevation as God's Messiah did not just save Jews, but also save non-Jews, if they acknowledge these things as well. The key point here is that while Paul's letters focus on these questions, and so don't give any kind of biography of Jesus, they do contain references that indicate Paul understood Jesus to have been a recent, historical, and earthly human being who was elevated to higher status after his death. He clearly believed Jesus had had a heavenly pre-existence, which was a common Jewish idea about the Messiah at the time, but also that he had been born as a human being, had lived on earth, had been crucified, and had died. Paul wrote these letters in the 50s AD, but his references indicate that he had come to believe this about Jesus in the early 30s AD. He also makes references that indicate he believed Jesus' death and resurrection had been recent and not long before Paul came to believe in them, probably just a few years earlier. So Paul says Jesus was born as a human, of a human mother, and born as a Jew. He repeats that he had a human nature and that he was a human descendant of King David, of Abraham, of Israelites, and of Jesse. He refers to his teachings that Jesus made during his earthly ministry on divorce, on preachers, and on the coming apocalypse. He mentions how he was executed by earthly rulers, that he was crucified, and that he died and was buried. And he says that he had an earthly, physical brother called James, who Paul himself had met. These references make it clear that Paul was talking about a recent human being, even if he had come to believe that Jesus was much, much more than that. And given that they are no less than the earliest references to Jesus in existence and date to within about 20 years of Jesus' lifetime, they pose a major problem for any claim that there was no historical Jesus. Of course, Jesus Mythicists have way to reinterpret all of them and conform them to the claim that Paul was talking about a purely celestial Jesus and wasn't referring to him as a human, earthly, historical and recent one. But these arguments are highly strained and contrived, and almost no scholars find them convincing. Take, for example, the last of the references in Paul's letters that I've just noted, the one where he mentions meeting James, the brother of the Lord. This is in a rather angry letter to the Jesus sect community in Galatia. Paul is writing this letter to defend his status as an authority and as an apostle, because some people had told the Galatians that Paul was a subordinate and second-tier believer who converted late and got his teachings from earlier believers who had been, in Paul's own words, apostles before me. This dispute about Paul's authority appears to be in the context of an argument within the early Jesus sect about whether non-Jews had to convert to Judaism and adopt Jewish practices, including circumcision, if they were to be saved by the death and resurrection of Jesus. Paul believed they did not, and claimed that he got this good news by visionary revelation from Jesus himself. But it appears his detractors had been undermining him over this teaching, and so Paul wrote to Galatia to angrily defend himself. In the process, he argues passionately for his independence from these earlier believers in the Jerusalem community, claiming he did not get his teachings or his authority from them. But he's forced to admit that after his vision of Jesus and conversion to the Jesus sect, he did, in fact, meet with at least some of these earlier elders. He says, "Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother." It's important to note here that Paul is not boasting of meeting James and Simon Peter, who he refers to by the Aramaic form of his nickname Cephas, but is rather reluctantly admitting that he did so. This is because he knows that doing so undercuts the argument for his independent authority that he's trying to make here. This means it's very difficult to credibly dismiss this admission as some kind of lie or fantasy. He clearly did meet Peter and James. This leaves Jesus Mythicism with a clear problem. It's impossible to meet with the flesh and blood brother of a celestial figure who never existed on earth. So if Paul met with Jesus' brother and mentions this matter-of-factly, in passing, and in a context which undermines the point he's trying to make, then it's clear Jesus existed and that Paul knew this. Of course, mythicists have convoluted arguments to get around this. They usually try to argue that brother of the Lord here is purely figurative, that Paul often refers to believers generally as brothers, so he doesn't mean the word literally here. The problem with this is that while Paul does often use the word adelphos, or brother, figuratively, here he uses a much more specific term, ton adelphos to Kyriou, the brother of the Lord, which he uses only here and one other place, 1 Corinthians 9, 3-6. The problem for mythicists is that in both places where he uses forms of this particular, more specific phrase, he mentions the brother of the Lord or the brothers of the Lord alongside other believers. So clearly this category refers to a specific subset of believers. It can't just mean believer. And we have multiple later references to Jesus having brothers, including one called James, to these brothers being among the community of believers after his death, and to James being a leading figure in the Jerusalem community. Given this later context, the most likely reading of James, the brother of the Lord, is that Paul is referring to Jesus' sibling. Jesus Mythicists try to claim there must have been some other subset of believers who held the title brothers of the Lord but weren't literally siblings of Jesus. But they have no actual evidence to support this pure supposition. So Occam's razor says Paul is most likely referring to meeting Jesus' brother. This reading gets more support from another reference to Jesus' brother James, this time from a non-Christian historian. There's a short account of Jesus in the Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus in book 1863-4, But this reference is highly controversial, and virtually all scholars agree that at least parts of it are not genuine. But Josephus makes a second reference to Jesus in Book 20, 200, and the overwhelming consensus of Josephus scholars is that this one is authentic. Here Josephus recounts a major political upheaval that occurred in his hometown when he was about 25. Josephus was a member of a priestly family, and a lot of his history details the politics of this priestly caste in Jerusalem. In 63 AD, the young Josephus had just returned from a diplomatic mission to the Roman Senate on behalf of the Jewish priests, when the high priest, Hanan ben Hanan, was deposed and replaced by the Romans. Josephus records that Hanan had taken advantage of the fact that the Roman procurator of Judea, Porcius Festus, had died while in office and his successor had not yet arrived from Rome. So Hanan decided to execute certain breakers of the law without Roman permission and got deposed as a result. And Josephus mentions these lawbreakers he executed included the brother of that Jesus who was called Messiah, James by name. Here's a Jewish historian who mentions the execution of this James and identifies him by reference to his brother Jesus, who he in turn identifies as that Jesus who was called Messiah, given that Jesus was a fairly common name. This execution triggered something that was a major political event in the young Josephus's life, and the execution happened in Josephus's own small city. Again, it's very hard to dismiss this fairly direct reference to Jesus' brother, though, again, Jesus Mythicists have a variety of highly convoluted but ultimately unconvincing ways of trying to do so. If, as it seems, the historical Jesus' preaching career was short and happened mainly in the backwater territory of Galilee, we would not expect to find any surviving references to it from his time. But if his sect survived his death and was led for some decades later by his brother James in the city of Jerusalem, it makes sense it would be much more likely we would find references to this longer-lived and more prominent brother. And that's exactly what we find. The Gospel accounts of Jesus were written at the end of the 1st century AD to the beginning of the 2nd century AD. They are largely theological narratives and can't be read as documentary biographies, and no secular critical scholar does so. But there are aspects of them which seem to indicate historical elements that point to a historical Jesus. These can be found when the Gospel writers include parts of the Jesus story that they feel they have to work into their narrative, but which they seem to struggle to fit with their claims about who and what Jesus was. This appears to be because as ideas about Jesus as the Messiah evolved, parts of the remembered stories about him no longer quite fitted with the developing conception of him as the Messiah, and later as divine. These awkward elements stick out as a result. For example, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is depicted as going to the River Jordan and being baptized by John the Baptist, after which he hears a voice from the heavens and goes off into the wilderness to fast. For the writer of the Gospel of Mark, this is the point where Jesus becomes the Messiah, and so there's no problem with him having his sins washed away by John, since prior to this point he was just a man like any other. The writer of the Gospel of Matthew, however, has a very different conception of Jesus as the Christ. In his version, Jesus has been ordained Messiah since his miraculous conception, so it's awkward for him to have the chosen one of God going to be baptized by John, who is a lesser prophet and lesser figure. So the Gospel of Matthew tells more or less the same story as he finds in the Gospel of Mark, which he uses as his source, but adds a small exchange of dialogue not found in the earlier version. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and yet you come to me?" And Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." And then he consented. When we turn to the last and latest of the Gospels, the Gospel of John, we find a very different story again. The writer of this Gospel depicts Jesus as being a mystical, pre-existent Messiah who had a heavenly existence since the beginning of time. So for him, the idea of Jesus being baptized by John is even more awkward. And he solves this problem by removing the baptism altogether. In this latest version, John is baptizing other people and telling them that the Messiah was to come, and then sees Jesus and declares him to be that Messiah. So there is no baptism of Jesus at all in the Gospel of John version. In these three examples, we have three different versions of the same story, written at three times in the early decades of Christianity. All of them are dealing with the baptism of Jesus by John in different ways and trying to make it fit with their conceptions of Jesus, and at least two of them are having some trouble doing so and are having to change the story to make it fit their ideas better. All this indicates that the encounter of Jesus and John was a historical event and known to be such, and so couldn't just be left out of the story. This left the later gospel writers with the problem of trying to make it fit with their evolving ideas about who and what Jesus was. And we find similar examples in other parts of the Jesus story that the gospel writers seem to find awkward to deal with. All of the gospels depict Jesus coming from Nazareth in Galilee, but two of them, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, also refer to a prophetic tradition that the Messiah was meant to have come from Bethlehem in Judea. So they tell complicated stories about Jesus somehow being born in Bethlehem but growing up in Nazareth. The only problem is these two Gospels tell two very different and actually contradictory stories to achieve this. Now that makes sense if Jesus was, rather inconveniently, from Nazareth and born in the wrong town, and so they had to shoehorn him into the Bethlehem idea to make him better fit expectations about the Messiah. If he didn't exist, however, mythicists have to explain why Nazareth is in the story at all. Why isn't he just Jesus of Bethlehem? And we find the gospel writers going to great lengths to explain why Jesus was crucified if he was the Messiah. The Messiah was meant to defeat Israel's enemies, usher in a new kingdom of God and rule at God's right hand, not get killed in the most humiliating way known at the time. The fact that Jesus was crucified and died was clearly a major problem for his early followers. Paul called it a stumbling block for the Jews and a scandal for the Gentiles. All of the Gospels expend a lot of time and energy trying to argue this was actually what was meant to happen, and to bolster this argument with references to various Jewish scriptures. The fact they have to work so hard to make this argument shows that the execution of Jesus was a rather awkward element in the whole Jesus story. But it appears they are forced to deal with it because it happened. So they have to find ways to fit it into their conception of Jesus as the Messiah. It makes sense that they were compelled to do this by the hard fact of their Messiah being crucified. But given that there is no evidence that anyone expected an executed Messiah before the rise of the Jesus sect, it does not make sense that anyone would make up a crucified Jesus and create this problem for themselves. That his execution was a historical fact that his followers had to accommodate is the most likely reading of the evidence. Many people who like the idea that no historical Jesus existed seem to find the fact that we have no contemporary references to Jesus himself powerfully significant. To modern people, the idea that someone would exist without any mentions of him in his lifetime doesn't make much sense. This ignores the fact that we have barely any references to most people in the ancient world. In a period of much lower literacy and far less bureaucracy and documentation, most people were born, lived and died without their existence being documented in any way. And because we only have a tiny fraction of surviving ancient documents, even quite famous people are often only known from sources that date to well after their death. So we have, for example, no contemporary sources for the famous Carthaginian general Hannibal. This means to expect to have any for someone like Jesus, a peasant Jewish preacher teaching obscure Jewish ideas to other peasants in a backwater part of Syria, is pretty clearly absurd. And if we want to get an idea of the number and nature of the references we would expect for someone like Jesus, we can assess this quite easily. We know of a number of other early first century Jewish preachers, prophets, and messianic claimants who were very much like Jesus and who actually seem to have been a bit more famous than he was. None of them are attested by contemporary sources. Like Jesus, all of them are only mentioned decades after their death in brief references or accounts. So we actually have more references to Jesus than we have for any other Jewish preacher of the time. Christian apologists often exaggerate the number of references to Jesus as a historical person that we have, claiming that multiple ancient writers referred to him. But most of these are talking about Jesus as the focus of the Christian sect's worship, not Jesus as a historical man. But the reference by Josephus I discussed earlier clearly does refer to him as a historical person. Contrary to some mythicist claims, so does the reference to him in Tacitus's Annals, book 1544. There, the very sceptical and careful Roman historian refers to Jesus as the human founder of the Christians and says that he was executed in Judea by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. That gives us a bald who, what, when and where for Jesus, and makes it clear that, writing less than a century later, Tacitus understood Jesus as a historical person. As is usual for ancient historians, we don't know where Tacitus got his information, but nothing in what he says indicates he's just repeating Christian claims. For most ancient figures, that reference alone would be enough for historians to accept the person most likely existed. Given that we also have the Josephus account of the execution of his brother, Paul's references, including meeting the same brother, and the awkward and likely historical elements in the Gospel accounts, it makes most sense that a historical Jewish preacher called Jesus lies at the core of the latest stories to form the basis of Christianity. Of course, many ex-Christians want Christianity to be as wrong as possible, and Jesus Mythicism provides them with that satisfaction. The idea that no historical Jesus existed at all also makes many of the questions about how various Christian claims about him arose, or what parts of the story about him may be true, totally redundant and therefore unnecessary. Mythicism means the whole package can be dismissed without much thought or effort. This seems to be much of its appeal for many of its more casual adherents. Its more determined proponents go to much greater lengths to maintain their position, and as I've noted, they have many long and detailed counter-arguments to everything I've said. Fringe theorists always have elaborate answers for all objections. But while we can't absolutely rule out the idea that no historical Jesus existed, the lengths mythicists have to go to prop up their thesis makes it highly unconvincing for those who have a detailed grasp of the relevant material. And it should be telling that the more someone knows about this topic, the less likely they are to be a mythicist. When almost all experts agree that a fringe theory is wrong and the proponents of the theory are marginal figures who have an ideological axe to grind, true skeptics should hear alarm bells. Who and what the historical Jesus most likely was is a further topic, and one that I'll delve into further here in the future. And I may well examine some of the arguments and counter-arguments of the Jesus Mythicists in more detail here as well. In the meantime, I'll give links to my ongoing series of detailed articles on Jesus Mythicism and why most scholars reject it in the description of this video. It's likely to be a topic I'll explore further on this channel. Until then, see you again here soon.